welcome to the Simplified Accountable Structure overview. We're going to spend just a few minutes giving you some sort of an idea if you're exploring Simplified Accountable Structure for your church, just to give you enough information to be able to explore the why and the how before you make a decision. And with me today is Brian, and we're just going to share some information with you that we hope will be helpful in your discernment if this is the best way forward for your church. Now, Brian, as you know, most churches, their actual structure is driving their church rather than the mission, right? The mission of making disciples. And when we talk about structure driving the church, you know, there's four pieces of that. And those are the calendar. Of course, if you do planning by simply copying one year onto the next without really discerning if that's God's will for your church, that would be one part of structure. So the second part of structure is the facility. And by facility, you know, Brian, we're talking about the building and the grounds and being good stewards of those. Now, the third piece of structure is finance. You know, that's your budget. Sometimes the budget drives the church, doesn't it? And how we make decisions about how we spend our money. Now, the fourth and final piece of structure is around how we make decisions, and we don't normally think about that as structure. In our United Methodist Church, that's about our committee structure. And when we're talking about simplified accountable structure, you know, we're talking about those four administrative teams: trustees, finance, SPR, and the council or board, whatever you call it in your local church. So when we talk about the structure driving your church rather than the mission driving your church, we're talking about those four components are the ones that are driving it rather than everything being connected with how we're making disciples. Now, if we're considering going into simplified accountable structure, we have two opportunities, and that is the change of technical and adaptive. And technical are those easy things that we can do that we kind of know how to get to those changes. But the adaptive changes are those that we've never considered, and we probably can't even figure out how to get there. And so this gives us the opportunity to go through both of those kinds of changes. But it isn't all great things that go along with structure, right? There's some problems sometimes that go with simplified structure. Brian, and what are some of those?
Well, some of the challenges or the problems in most structures that we experience within the church or in organizations in general, our structure can sometimes promote disunity. It enables dysfunction. In some structures, challenges are with like the authority, clear lines of authority, who can make decisions and who's authorized to make those decisions. But there's also, along with that, no clear lines of accountability. So for decisions that are made, who's responsible for the outcomes of those decisions and what that might look like within an organization. Sometimes our structure, it puts all the responsibility on the pastor. And in most cases, that pastor's really given no authority or little authority, even though they're carrying most of the responsibility. And so there's an imbalance there, and that's an unhealthy organization, unhealthy structure, right? And then one of the difficulties in a bulky organization, a bulky structure, is that it's really difficult to make timely decisions or challenging decisions. You know, you may have a congregation member who's really passionate and fired up with an idea and wants to present it as a ministry item, and then it needs to go through finance, and then it needs to go through maybe trustees if it's a facility ministry, and then it has to go back to finance, and then it has to go to SPRC or something, you know, so like it may take 3 months to make a decision, and by that time your layperson or your church member is already burned out and has given up. And so those bulky structures really make it difficult to move where the Spirit's leading us in a nimble way. Right. And then our structures, they really allow us to focus on maintaining what's already here, the status quo, keep things the way that they are, rather than to engage us in mission, to make disciples for the transformation of the world, to go out into our neighborhood and offer Jesus' love, because we're focused on the maintenance of our structure. But our book of discipline, the United Methodist Church, we've made some changes in how we can structure ourselves so that we can be more nimble, so that we can be healthy and fruitful and empowered to go out and do the work that God's called us to do. Paragraph 247.2 in the Book of Discipline and 2016 version, it says that we can break down to those four administrative teams: finance, trustees, SPRC, and the church council, however you call that, in your particular congregation. They cease to exist in the traditional structure as they are now, but they're replaced by a team with responsibilities, who take on those responsibilities that those four committees had previously. And so this is what that might look like.
Yeah. And so I always find it interesting, who was that originally written for?
Well, it was written for the small local congregations. But what's been fascinating to see is that our largest congregations have seen how effective that it can be in leading a congregation to move out beyond the walls. And so they've actually taken it on ahead of the small local churches.
That it was intended for.
That it was written for.
Exactly,
right? Yeah.
Exactly. And so that just kind of talks about this being a possible structure for all size churches, right? Because we've seen that in all size churches, that this is actually a workable structure. So when we talk about consolidating these four administrative teams, it's kind of hard to imagine to begin with how all of that can be done. But I think the biggest piece we have to understand is most of the time the work that we have been doing in those four administrative teams is actually management of the church. And when we are managing the church, we're not talking about mission and vision.
Right.
I don't know about you, but I've been to many a council meeting where Jesus and the mission of making disciples was never mentioned. Have you had that experience as well? Yeah.
Yes.
So when we go to this new model, it gives us the opportunity then to be thinking at those levels of mission and vision. So here's how it works. Those four administrative teams, like Brian said, cease to exist, and instead you have one combined leadership team. And the 247.2 in the Book of Discipline says you can move to any structure as long as it is approved by your district superintendent and as long as it meets all the Book of Discipline requirements. So the Book of Discipline requirements in those four teams says that we need to have a minimum of 9 people on our leadership team. So we recommend somewhere between 9 and 13. And most churches choose to simplify as much as possible and usually do the 9 members. Now, when we think about those 9 members, think about all of those folks actually serving with 4 hats. They're serving in the capacity of all 4 of those teams at large. Now, by Book of Discipline, there's also some other requirements that we need to meet, like the chair of that team. You still need a lay leader. You still need a lay member of annual conference. If you have chartered United Methodist men and chartered United Methodist women, they're a part of that team. And of course, we want a youth person. Now, if you think about 9 at-large people and then you add all of those positions, that certainly adds up to more than 13. But the beauty in all of this is to consolidate. We can have people having multiple titles, multiple responsibilities. So your chair could also be your lay leader. Your lay leader could also be your lay member. You would also need your liaison to your district superintendent. That could also be your chair. And it sounds like you're piling on, but when you are actually governing instead of managing, it really is work that can be done and is possible in 90 minutes or less a month, right? When we're able to do that. So all 9 people, 9 to 13 people serve on SPRC, right? All 9 serve on trustees. All 9 serve on finance and the council. So it's a really cool process, and we can really consolidate. And we're finding that when churches do that, they can really move the mission along. Now, we talked about adaptive change, and the adaptive change is when we begin to think about the conversation and the materials that are covered when we're doing simplified accountable structure. So could you kind of give us what those big chunks that we'll be talking about as we change into this model?
Yeah, so there would be the three main areas of responsibility. The financial piece, the generative piece, and then the strategic piece. It's not the management of or maintaining the structure, but it's really about thinking proactively about where God's calling us to be and how we as a church can best send ourselves out there, and make more people available to do the work. One of the fascinating things for me when I think about this is that those 4 committees are, generally speaking, made up of 9 to 12 people. And so you're going from 4 groups of 9 to 12 people down to 1 group. And so that's freeing up, 27 people more to go out and actually do ministry out into the world. And so the areas of responsibility for this single board, are the financial pieces, some administrative pieces, but then the generative work of creating or living into the mission and vision, and enabling and empowering the people of the church to live into the mission and to the vision, and then to continue to think strategically, not just for the next meeting, but for this year, and then 2 years down the road, where does God where's God calling us to be? And this way of living really frees us up to think long term, what's best for the people around us and how we can partner as a church. And so, part of that, when we think about the responsibilities, it means changing or transforming how we meet and what that looks like. Instead of, I don't know about you, Ken, but, you could almost, in some meetings I've been to, the same report is given from this month to the next month. The only thing that's changed is the date. Right. And it's a lot of just stalled movement. What this really does is it creates for us a way to create an agenda that moves us to thinking about engaging with the people around us, but also thinking about the future. And so a typical agenda, how would you think about creating a typical agenda out of this structure?
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think about this as when we move into this model, if we don't change the agenda, all we're doing is with fewer people around the table, and we're having the same conversation and we're going to have the same results. So using kind of those fiduciary, generative, and strategic kind of big buckets, this is the area that I kind of think about, what does this agenda looks like specifically? And again, I'm sure you've seen it too, Brian, where you have churches that have moved into a place where they are no longer like their neighborhood. They don't know their neighborhood. And it's because we haven't been doing that generative and that strategic work. We've just been managing and doing the same thing month after month after month with the same reports with a different date, right? And so the other shift in this is when we begin to do simplified accountable structure, we are also much more lay-driven. And the first 3 items on the agenda that we're going to be talking through are the work of the laity. And too often we put all the responsibility on our pastor to drive the entire agenda, and that's not the way it was intended. So of course we're going to start with prayer, and we always suggest that the prayer is an opportunity for everyone to be able to participate. And some people are uncomfortable with that, but if we don't start practicing prayer in the comfort and safety of our own leaders, our own congregation, then we're never going to do it outside. So we're going to start with prayer, and we're going to all take turns doing that. Then these are the leaders of our church. So how are we pouring into our leaders, both with spiritual gifts as well as leadership? So we're going to spend time doing some spiritual development and also some leadership development. This will be a third of our meeting. Now, Brian, we do that in the beginning intentionally because we know what would happen if we put it at the end, right?
Right.
We'd never get to it. Right. So it's important enough that we want to put it at the beginning so that we make sure that that piece happens. And again, those pieces are also done by the laity. So after we get through the development, then we're going to talk about new people. Again, have you ever been to a council meeting where you talk about new people?
Not really.
Yeah. I wish we could say we could, right? So when we talk about new people in small churches, that's probably individual names because that's appropriate there. And when we're talking about new people in larger churches, that's probably numbers. So how many first-time guests are we having, and what's our return guest rate? How many second-time guests are we having? And what we're talking about here, what we're wanting to make sure is, number one, that we're having first-time guests and returning guests. But we're also showing that that's the important piece. That's the crux of our mission, is to make sure that new people are coming into the life of the congregation. So we want to make sure that that movement is happening. So after that, then we go into the review of the goals. Well, Brian, that would mean we would have to have goals, right?
Right.
And so that's probably a new thing also for churches, is to do strategic ministry planning that results in what are the goals that we need to accomplish this year so that the vision becomes a reality, as the unique way that we make disciples.
Right.
This is the piece where the accountability of the pastor comes in. So what are we doing to move the church forward through our ministry so that the vision becomes a reality? And this is where the pastor is reporting back, not on individual ministries that have happened, but through the ministries, the movement of the church has resulted in the advancement of the goals. So we keep a much higher level of conversation than getting into the weeds of, how many kids showed up at trunk or treat and how many pieces of candy we handed out. Because that's not very helpful, right, to spend leaders' time on. So after we go through the review of the goals, then we actually get to the pressing issues, the pressing problems. And my experience has been that's usually where we've spent the bulk of our time, right? And so these are things that have fallen outside of the guiding principles. And these are things that have given permission giving for our church within safe boundaries. Okay, so this is where the exceptions come into play, rather than everyone coming for every piece of information and every piece of permission. From there, we move into the packet. This is kind of our consent. Now, have you ever been to a meeting where you actually go in and there are piles of paper and reports and you're picking them up on the way in, and in minutes you're asked to vote on them when you've never even read them?
Right, yeah.
So this is sending out an electronic packet ahead of time so that the leaders have had a time to review it. And then you have conversation and questions rather than take the time to review it there or to approve it without ever having reviewed it. And so that's your standard things like financial reports, minutes, and so on. Then we go to a piece that's probably new for most churches, and that is communication. And when we talk about communication, that means, what did we decide here tonight?
Yeah.
I've been to meetings where somebody next to me thought something else happened differently than I did. What happened here tonight? Who needs to know about what just happened, and who's the communicator, and what's that messaging going to be? Just so we're all on the same page before we leave. And then we pray, and that can be anybody in the room, not only the pastor. So that's how we move into accountable leadership, because we have different agenda and we have a different conversation.
Hi, Kay. So Brian was telling me about your discussion about the simplified structure, and I love it. I'm a huge advocate for it. And I wanted to share with you what I personally have loved most about the simplified structure. And it's around the area of accountability.
Oh, that's an important piece of this, isn't it?
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think every single church needs to be practicing accountable leadership. There's no way to do the simplified structure without accountable leadership, or it can just be dangerous. It can cause more harm than good. And I love what I've learned from this in this process is that accountable leadership done well is this combination of responsibility, authority, and accountability. And so how I've experienced that played out in the life of the church and the shift and the difference it makes is that ministry, the main aspects of ministry are done by the people, by the congregation. And then when you think about the role of the staff, typically we say, I want kids ministry at the church, so let's hire a kids minister so the kids minister can do all of the kids ministry. But in this new structure, it's the job of the staff not to do it all, but to coordinate, to manage, to inspire, to form the teams necessary so the people can do the ministry. And then the other shift comes for the pastor, right? So now the pastor's main job is to cast vision, to teach, to equip, to hold the staff accountable as they are managing those who are in ministry. And then the board, now freed from all this management and all these responsibilities, can focus on the big picture issues, right? On the accountability and the support, and the overall governance of the church. Are they meeting their goals? And it's just been so powerful and exciting for me. So if you were to explain, in brief, what the next steps are for a church that's wanting to implement this, what do they need to do to follow the rules and be good Methodists?
Exactly. We have to follow the book of discipline, right? So one of the first things we want to make sure is that we are in collaboration and communication with the district superintendent because as we talked about earlier with Brian is when we look at 247.2 paragraph in the book Discipline, it talks about this is a partnership with your district superintendent. And so it starts there with the district superintendent being informed that we're exploring this. So even while you're talking about it, you don't wait until you're ready to approve it. You get your district superintendent involved to begin with because your district superintendent may say, I'm familiar with, it might be a new appointment, and I'm familiar with this church, and I'm just not sure that this is the right season. And they would know that kind of thing. So we want to make sure we bring the district superintendent in right away. The next thing we want to make sure is that the congregation is on board. If you have just over half, 51% of your congregation who wants to go with that, that could be really dangerous. I think sometimes it's better to wait a little longer and get more people kind of on board before we make that shift. It's just healthier when we have more people. We don't need to get to 100% consensus, right? That's not always the healthiest thing to wait for either, but we certainly want a greater majority. And then we need to understand what we're moving into. And that not only do we know that we're going to have fewer meetings and we're going to have less people involved in the administration of the church, which are kind of fun things to think about. Fewer meetings and fewer people have to be tied up. But when we only look at that technical piece and we don't look at the adaptive piece of this, meaning what's the conversation going to change? How are people going to be held responsible and accountable in different ways? Then we have lost the opportunity to do the adaptability piece. So we need to understand that we're moving into both of these, simplified and accountable structure. So there's a lot of communication and a lot of equipping that needs to happen before we move into it. And then of course, you've got to have your nominations process because nominations is not eliminated in this. The Nominations and Lay Leadership Development Committee is a requirement still in this model. And so they'll do their work of discerning those 9 to 13 people that are going to be on the board. And then you have to have your final DS approval, and normally your DSs want a letter to state the missional purpose in order to move to this, because that's what the Book of Discipline says. You can structure in any way as long as it makes the mission possible. So that final letter to your district superintendent stating this is the missional reasons for moving so, and then your district superintendent can schedule a charge conference, but we really recommend a church conference. This way, your entire church is involved in that decision, not just your leadership with a charge conference. Then, at that charge conference, we want to make sure that when we vote, we're voting the 4 current administrative teams out as we vote the new leadership in, so that we clean kind of the slate before the new come in. So we want to make sure that we do that church conference well. Now, we would say, well, that's the end of the process, but really, as we know, that's just the beginning, right?
Exactly.
And what we highly recommend is that all the board is trained. And we use Mission Possible, but we also use Winning on Purpose. Those are our two key resources to help our leaders kind of live into this. We also find that we train those original 9 to 13 people, and then we think we're good to go. But when we've been in this other structure for decades, in 3 years, those folks that have been trained have all moved out and new people have moved in, and they have brought the old way of leading because they haven't been trained in any other way. So for many, many years, until this new structure kind of captures the congregation in a new way, we have to train every year on this model. We also have found a best practice is to have a coach that walks alongside you, helps you get it set up well, start well, meaning your leadership covenant is done, your guiding principles are done, and that you truly get to the point of doing governance and not the management, because it's really hard to slip back into those old ways of doing that we've been doing for so long. So if you have someone with you that points out, friends, I'm not sure that you realize that you are still managing over here. So how can we course correct and keep ourselves from doing that? Our meetings will certainly go more than 90 minutes when we're managing as well. So there is actually a 10-step process that we have identified, but that gives you kind of an overview of the process and those pieces. But you cannot over-communicate with your congregation, and the equipping cannot be overstated either of really the healthier ways to move into this. Hey friends, thank you for tuning in to the Simplified Accountable Structure overview. We hope that you have found it helpful. You'll see the identified steps to get you started in the process appearing on your screen now. Now, I want to remind you that this is just the overview to get you started. There is full training workshops available. Also be sure to check out the books Mission Possible as well as Winning on Purpose. Those are the two recommended resources to get you started in this model. So we wish you blessings on your journey, and if there's anything we can do to be helpful, please don't hesitate to reach out at k@kcotan.com.